Good evening, friends. Settle yourself wherever you are. Maybe you're in bed already, with your pillow shaped just right. Or maybe you're winding down, letting the room grow a little dimmer. Go ahead, lower the lights. If you'd like, pull a blanket up to your chin and listen to the small sounds around you. The faint hum of a heater, the lazy tick of a clock, the quiet rustle of fabric as you breathe. Tonight we're going to drift, slowly, gently, into a story about a ship that disappeared beneath the waves more than 4 centuries ago. It's a tale of gold and storms, of patience and paperwork, but mostly it's about time itself, how something can sleep undisturbed for 300 years and still wait to be found. If this calm journey helps you unwind, you can tap the like button or subscribe, but only if it feels right. For now, just let the sound of the words roll like waves against the side of a quiet harbor. Let me tell you how the night began. It was late summer, the year 1622, and the Caribbean was restless. Imagine the sky, swollen with heavy clouds that looked almost purple in the fading light, and a warm wind that smelled of salt and citrus, and the faint spice of the cargo waiting to sail home to Spain. There, in Havana Harbor, a fleet of Spanish galleons stood ready. They were fat-bellied, beautiful ships with names that sounded like prayers. The Santa Margarita, the Nuestra Señora de Atocha, the Nuestra Señora del Rosario. Each one creaked softly as sailors hauled ropes and tightened sails, and the harbor echoed with 100 small human noises. The scrape of barrels, the slap of water against wood, the low whistle of someone already dreaming of the taverns of Seville. The Atocha was the pride of them all. She was barely 2 years old, new and strong. A royal galleon designed to carry the treasure of an empire. Her decks were crowded with crates of silver bars, chests of coins stamped with the faces of kings, and even small boxes of emeralds from Colombia that glittered like drops of jungle rain. There were gold chalices wrapped in cloth, bolts of indigo, and a few exotic gifts, cacao beans, parrots, and porcelain, that officers hoped would delight the court. No one on board thought much about storms. Hurricanes were simply part of the world then, like taxes or creaky shoes. But sailors were a superstitious breed, and some whispered that the sea that evening had a strange stillness to it. They said the gulls flew low, the air was too warm, and the horizon blurred in a way that made it hard to tell where the sky ended and the ocean began. Even the water seemed to be holding its breath. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The muffled thump of waves against the hull, the occasional clink of a coin shifting inside a chest, the distant laughter of sailors who had convinced themselves that tomorrow would be calm. They had no idea that the sea was already drawing its deep breath, the way it does before it roars. As night fell, the fleet unfurled its sails and slipped out through the Straits of Florida, bound for Spain. The Atocha moved slowly, her hold heavy with the weight of half a continent's silver. Above her, the sky was thick with stars, the kind of night where even the darkest corners glittered. But on the horizon, a bruise of cloud was growing. Somewhere far off, thunder muttered, low, uncertain, like a giant turning over in his sleep. It's strange, isn't it? How danger can begin so quietly. A single gust of wind that catches a lantern flame, a slight shift in the waves. The Atocha's helmsman noticed it first. The sails straining, the ropes humming under tension. The wind had changed direction. And then the rain came, soft at first, almost playful, pattering against the deck like coins tossed from heaven. But soon it was slashing sideways, and the wind screamed through the rigging like a living thing. The captain shouted orders, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. Men ran barefoot across the slick deck, trying to reef the sails, but the ropes were stiff with salt and water. Within minutes, the mainmast cracked, the sound sharp and final as a gunshot. Lightning flashed, white, searing, and for an instant the sea looked like molten glass. In that blinding moment, someone swore they saw another ship vanish completely, as if the ocean had simply decided to erase it. The Atocha fought hard. She was built for strength, her hull thick with Cuban mahogany and pine. But nature was older and stronger. The rudder snapped. Waves taller than houses smashed over the bow, sweeping barrels and men alike into the dark. Below deck, water poured in faster than anyone could bail it out. Imagine the sound. Timbers groaning, metal clanging, prayers half shouted and half swallowed by wind. And then, quite suddenly, a silence deeper than fear. When a ship breaks, there's a strange calm that follows, as though the ocean itself is taking a breath. The Atocha rolled once, twice, and then was gone. Only a few splintered planks remained, bobbing like driftwood under a bruised sky. The storm raged on, indifferent. By morning, the sea was smooth again, as if nothing had happened. Fishermen along the Cuban coast saw pieces of wreckage washing ashore, bits of mast, broken barrels, the occasional glitter of a coin wedged between shells. They didn't know it then, but somewhere out there, in the shallow reefs of the Florida Keys, the Atocha had come to rest in about 50 feet of water, cradled in sand and coral. The survivors, there were only a handful, were picked up by another ship days later. They spoke of chaos, of lightning that seemed to stab the water itself, of comrades swallowed whole. One man said he heard bells ringing underwater, the ship's own warning echoing back from the deep. Another swore he saw coins floating in the foam, glinting like tiny suns before sinking out of sight. When they reached Havana again, they carried little more than their stories, and those stories became records in the archives. Neat lines of ink in a language that smelled of dust and candle smoke. Centuries have a way of softening tragedy. The Atocha became legend, then rumor, then a line in an inventory that nobody bothered to read. Empires rose and fell. Oceans shifted their moods. Storms came and went, and the reef kept its secret. If you listen closely, you can almost hear that silence now, the hush beneath the waves where the ship sleeps. It's not a frightening silence. It's patient, like someone waiting to be remembered. Schools of fish weave between the cannons. Coral grows over the silver bars, painting them in pinks and oranges. Somewhere down there, a gold chalice still lies on its side, catching moonlight that filters through the water in trembling ribbons. The sea has turned the Atocha into a kind of underwater cathedral, every plank a pew, every bubble a prayer. I sometimes imagine the last moments of quiet before the storm, how the crew might have leaned against the railings, talking about home, not knowing that their voices would be the last sounds the Atocha would ever hear. It's strange to think that all those words, those tiny breaths of conversation, are still trapped somewhere in the water, vibrating faintly through time. And yet, that's how history often works. We live, we speak, we vanish, and the sea or the sand or the pages of a forgotten archive keep our echoes safe. Maybe that's why stories like this feel so peaceful. They remind us that even loss can rest outside your window now. The night might be calm again. Maybe there's a bit of wind, or the soft rhythm of rain. Let that sound blend with the image of the quiet ocean after the storm, the way the clouds break apart and reveal a thin silver moon, and how the waves smooth themselves into sleep. That's where our story will drift for now. Because even though the Atocha was gone, her name did not disappear entirely. It lingered, in ledgers, in letters, in the dusty rooms of Spanish archives. And more than 3 centuries later, that faint paper trail would guide another set of dreamers, armed not with cannons, but with maps, magnets, and an unshakable patience, to the very place where the sea had been silent for so long. And as we leave that night behind, let your mind wander with them, back toward the sunlight and the sound of gulls, where a new chapter waits to begin. Imagine the sun the morning after the storm. It rose late, pale and tired, as if the sky itself had been shaken through the night. The sea was strangely gentle again, slick as glass, scattered here and there with broken timber and small golden flashes where coins caught the light. From the deck of a surviving ship, sailors leaned over the rails, squinting into the rippling brightness, searching for movement. But the sea gave nothing back except the slow drift of wreckage and the hollow slap of water against wood. For months afterward, Havana whispered of the lost fleet. Merchants mourned their fortunes, and priests prayed for souls they'd never met. The city had always lived by the rhythm of galleons coming and going, the clatter of cart wheels, the scent of sugar and saltpeter, the chatter of dockhands bargaining over barrels. Now the harbour felt hollow. Some nights, when the wind came in from the quays, locals claimed they could hear bells, faint metallic notes echoing over the waves, like the ghostly ring of a ship calling for help, centuries too late. I like to think of those bells as the sea's way of keeping a secret alive. Every sound underwater lingers. It bends and travels, rippling outward through layers of salt and silence. Maybe, even now, in the low frequencies the human ear can't catch, the Atocha still hums somewhere down there. A quiet vibration, a memory trying to surface. 300 years passed. Empires changed flags. Steam replaced sails. Divers learned to breathe from tanks and listen to the click of regulators instead of the creak of rope. But the reef never forgot. It grew taller, crusted with coral and sponge, and all the while, silver bars lay stacked like sleeping bricks beneath it. In the early 20th century, fishermen near the Marquesas Keys sometimes snagged their nets on something heavy below. They'd curse, haul up splintered wood or green-tinted coins, and toss them aside, thinking them unlucky. Occasionally, a child would bring a corroded silver disc to a shopkeeper in Key West, and the adults would laugh. A souvenir from the old Spanish days. No one realized that each coin was a whisper from the Atocha, surfacing for a breath before slipping back into silence. When I picture that seabed, I see light filtering down like dust through cathedral windows. Tiny fish flicker between shadows. Anemones sway like curtains in a draught. Everything moves slowly there, as if time itself swims in syrup. Sand drifts in slow curls over cannons half buried in coral. A turtle glides past a row of iron nails that once held the ship's deck together. If you brush the sand away, you might still see the faint etching of a Spanish crown on a bar of silver. But of course, no one brushed the sand away, not yet. Centuries of quiet are their own kind of weight. When people think of lost treasure, they imagine drama, gleaming gold, triumphant discovery. But the truth, at least at first, is just stillness. The kind of stillness you find in an old attic, where every object hums faintly with the years it's endured. The Atocha slept like that, a heavy dream beneath a light ocean. Then, one day in the 1960s, a man in California read a book about shipwrecks. He was a diving instructor named Mel Fisher, cheerful, stubborn, perpetually sunburned. He taught thousands of people how to breathe underwater, how to trust the hiss of a regulator and the pressure of depth. But what really fascinated him were the stories of the Spanish treasure fleets. Gold, he thought, had a way of hiding. It was the world's most patient metal. And if the Atocha had indeed gone down somewhere off Florida, maybe the ocean was ready to give it back. It's funny to imagine history turning quietly like that. One person in a library flipping a page that would wake a 300-year-old secret. Mel told his wife, Deo, that they should move east. She laughed, thought he was joking. But within a year, they had packed their lives into a van and driven to the Florida Keys. They brought with them little more than a small boat, a few homemade detectors, and a belief that treasure, like happiness, usually hides under layers of mud. Their friends called them dreamers. Locals called them fools. But Mel liked to say, today's the day, every morning, no matter the weather. He said it so often, it became a kind of family prayer. For years they searched. They drifted over turquoise shallows, following sun-bleached maps and half-translated Spanish documents that smelled of old glue. The ocean looked infinite. Their boat looked like a toy. Most days they found only bottle caps, anchors from modern boats, or lumps of coral shaped inconveniently like treasure chests. Yet each failure sounded a little like progress. Another whisper added to the conversation between humans and the sea. Have you ever noticed how patience has a sound? It's the gentle clank of a spade, the soft hiss of bubbles rising from a diver's mask. It's the rhythm of small hopes stacking up until, somehow, they become something solid. That was the soundtrack of Mel's life. Then came a discovery, not of treasure, but of method. Visibility near the seafloor was awful. Clouds of silt turned every dive into a brown fog. So Mel tinkered with pipes, fans, and propellers until he invented the prop wash deflector, a device that sent clean water downward, clearing the sand like curtains drawn back from a window. It was, in its way, as elegant as any invention from the age of sail. The sea, for the first time in centuries, blinked its eyes open. What it saw was strange. People in rubber suits hovering above the place where wooden masts once stood, their lights sweeping back and forth like curious fireflies. And as they cleared the sediment, fragments began to appear. A rusted spike, a hinge, a piece of pottery glazed the color of old bone. Then an anchor, enormous and black, lying on its side like a sleeping giant. Mel touched it, ran his gloved fingers along the iron, and smiled into his mask. It wasn't gold, but it was proof that something human still waited down there. That evening, back on the boat, they spread the artifacts across the deck. The metal was rough, covered in barnacles, but under the lamplight it shone faintly. The air smelled of salt and diesel. Mosquitoes whined lazily in the distance. Someone poured cheap rum into tin cups. The crew talked quietly, voices soft, so as not to disturb whatever old spirits might be listening. They didn't know it yet, but they were standing on the edge of one of history's longest conversations. 300 years of silence about to be broken. When night came, Mel sat alone at the stern. The water was calm again, rippling under the stars. He thought about the sailors who had stood in the same spot, centuries earlier, watching the same constellation of lights and wondering what the next day would bring. The difference was that they had been sailing into the storm, and he, perhaps, was sailing out of it. It's easy to romanticize discovery. We like to imagine trumpets and triumph, but most of it looks like this. A man sitting quietly on a boat, listening to waves slap against metal, feeling the slow roll of the tide under his feet, and believing, stubbornly, irrationally, that the sea still has something to say beneath him. The whispers continued. Currents stirred the sand around the Atocha's hull, as though the ocean was sighing in its sleep. Fish darted through the beams of moonlight that reached down like fingers. If you were to dive there that night, you might have heard it too. A faint clinking, like coins nudging one another in their chests. A sound too soft for greed, just enough for memory. That's the sound we'll follow next. The moment when whispers turn to clues, when coincidence begins to look like a map. For now, breathe slowly. Picture the surface of the water smoothing out beneath the stars. The hum of the boat settling into rhythm with your heartbeat. Because the story of the Atocha isn't really about treasure at all. It's about listening closely enough to hear what history has been trying to tell us. Very, very quietly. For 300 years, and as we leave Mel there, watching the horizon lighten with dawn, let your thoughts drift with the tide toward the next gentle chapter of this long conversation between humans and the sea. There's a certain sound that belongs only to archives. If you've ever stepped into one, you'll know it. The hush of air too still to stir dust. The faint crackle when a page turns after 300 years of waiting. That's where our story drifts next. Not to the sea, but to a room in Seville, where sunlight slips through iron-barred windows and lands across miles of parchment. Picture narrow aisles lined with ledgers bound in leather that smells faintly of wax and rain. In one corner sits a man in a wrinkled linen shirt, his glasses sliding down his nose. His name is Eugene Lyon, a historian with the patient posture of someone who listens more than he speaks. He's searching for a ghost, or rather, for the bureaucratic traces of one. You see, long after the Atocha sank, the Spanish crown kept records of everything that had gone down with it. Empires may have been ruled by kings, but they were sustained by accountants. Every coin, every bar of silver, every emerald wrapped in cloth was listed somewhere, in precise handwriting that tilted like waves against a shore. Eugene spent his days reading those lists, his finger tracing ink that had dried centuries before. It wasn't glamorous work, more like trying to hear a melody through a wall, but sometimes a note would slip through, a date, a name, a small remark in the margin, recovered near the Marquesas. He'd circle it gently, breathe out through his nose, and move on history, like the ocean, reveals itself in tides, little by little, page by page. One afternoon, he found something curious. A letter written 4 years after the Atocha went down. It described a search party that had ventured toward a group of small islands west of Key West, the Marquesas Keys. That letter was the hinge on which the whole story would turn. When Eugene shared it with Mel Fisher, the diver grinned the way a child might grin at the sight of a map leading to a cookie jar. Let's pause here for a breath. You can imagine the air between them, paper dust and salt mixed together. As the old story of the Atocha began to wake again, Mel spread the copy of the letter on the deck of his boat that night. The inked lines looked fragile, but to him they were bright as neon. He traced the coordinates with one calloused finger, whispering the names to himself like a spell. Marquesas Keys, southwest by west. The ocean around him was dark, but the words glowed in his imagination like lanterns. They moved their search the next week. The crew packed the deflector pipes, the sonar, the metal detectors, and headed for that new stretch of sea. If you've ever changed direction after years of doing something the same way, you'll know how exhilarating and terrifying that feels. Like moving furniture in a house you've lived in too long. The Marquesas Keys greeted them with wide turquoise shallows and long, lazy waves. From above, the water looked clear enough to drink, but as soon as the divers sank below, the world turned murky, a thick haze of silt and memory. It was like swimming inside an unshaken snow globe. Mel wasn't discouraged. He'd expected the ocean to be secretive. He used to say the sea was a lady with moods. Some days she let you see the freckles on her shoulders, and some days she folded her arms and turned away. That day she was shy. So he decided to improvise. He lowered the prop wash tubes again, aiming them carefully toward the bottom. Clear water plunged downward, spinning sand in swirling columns. The visibility bloomed open. Suddenly the seabed lay visible like a rumpled carpet. The divers could see their own shadows again, faint ghosts waving hello. Then, beneath a drift of shell and coral, one of them spotted a shape. Not gold, not silver, but something sturdier. A cannonball, dark as a bruise. They marked the spot on their map with a neat circle. A few yards away, another circle, and another. By evening, the chart looked like a connect-the-dots puzzle sketched by someone half asleep. But to Mel, those circles were breadcrumbs. Weeks passed in that rhythm. Dive, clear, search, surface, mark. Some days, they found nothing but seaweed. Others, fragments of iron or shards of pottery glazed sea green. Each artifact was carefully numbered, logged, and sealed in bags that smelled faintly of brine. The deck filled with labelled boxes, an odd sort of treasure that looked more like a collection of very damp history homework one evening. As the sun melted into the horizon, Deo Fisher brought Mel a mug of instant coffee. He sat hunched over the map, the circles beginning to form a faint line, like a constellation across the sea floor. She leaned beside him, squinting at it. "It's starting to look like handwriting," she said softly. Mel smiled. Maybe the ocean's finally writing back. There's something beautifully human about that, answering a centuries-old mystery not with shouting or dynamite, but with pencil dots and patience. Every ring of ink on that map meant a diver had spent an hour under pressure, moving slowly through the dark, guided by faith in coordinates scribbled by a long-dead clerk. One morning, they cleared another patch of sand, and something new emerged. An enormous anchor, its flukes half buried. It rose from the sediment like a fossilized bird spreading its wings. The divers stared, bubbles drifting from their masks like sighs. It wasn't treasure, not in the shiny sense. But anchors are storytellers. They mean presence. They mean a ship once tried to hold itself still here. When they hauled a fragment to the surface, Mel ran his fingers along the iron and laughed. That low, contented laugh of someone whose hunch has just been confirmed. He looked at the map again, at the curving line of circles, and whispered the same words he said every day. "Today's the day." At night, the boat rocked gently. Someone tuned a small radio, the static blending with the soft slap of waves. The crew ate canned beans and fried fish on paper plates. Above them, stars scattered across the sky like spilled sugar. You could hardly tell where the heavens ended and the sea began. They shimmered together. Two mirrors reflecting an old secret. I often think that's what patience really is. Learning to live in that reflection. Knowing that the answer might be just one breath away, but still letting the night be what it is. Then, late that summer, came the first real shimmer of proof. A diver brushed away a patch of sand and saw silver. He blinked, thinking it a trick of light. But when he reached down, his glove touched a cool, flat surface. A bar, heavy as truth. He tugged, it shifted, and beneath it gleamed another. They rose from the seabed one by one, like teeth of an old comb. When they surfaced, the crew crowded around. The bars were dull grey, crusted with lime, yet unmistakably precious. Each bore a mark, a stamped number, a a symbol of a foundry long vanished. Mel cross-checked those markings with a cargo manifest copied from the Seville archives. Line by line, symbol by symbol, they matched. There it was, the handwriting of 1622, alive again in metal. The map of paper had led them to the map of the sea. The next days, blurred into celebration and disbelief, they cleaned the bars carefully, not with polish, but with electricity. Electrolysis, the gentle fizz of centuries dissolving off the surface. Coins followed, hundreds, then thousands, their edges soft from the sea. It was like finding time itself minted in silver. And yet, amid all that excitement, the boat remained oddly peaceful. The crew spoke in low voices. Even laughter came out hushed, as if they were afraid to wake the ghosts below. A few of them sat on deck that night, feet dangling over the edge, watching the phosphorescent glow where the propellers stirred the water, tiny organisms lighting up like embers. Maybe the sea's applauding, someone murmured. But Mel just smiled, eyes half closed. No, he said, she's whispering there's more. Because history, like the sea, never gives everything at once. There were still mysteries buried deeper, cannons, emeralds, stories of loss and survival waiting to rise through the water. For now, though, let's leave Mel under the starlight, a map of paper drying beside him, the quiet waves tracing their slow applause against the hull. As the engines hum down to silence, picture the surface smoothing over again, hiding all signs of discovery. Only the rhythm of the tide remains, steady and slow, carrying us toward the next chapter, the one where sand and silver begin to trade secrets in the dark. Sometimes, the ocean rewards patience with beauty before wealth, before the coins, before the jewels. It offered Mel Fisher and his crew a sight so quietly breathtaking that it silenced even the most talkative diver. Sunlight bending through green water, illuminating an underwater plain of silver bars stacked like a staircase to nowhere. Let's drift there for a moment. Imagine you're weightless, surrounded by that soft blue-green light that hums in your ears. You feel the slow tug of your breath through the regulator. In, out, a rhythm that matches the pulse of the sea. Tiny bubbles rise past your mask, shimmering like mercury. You brush your glove over the sand, and it curls away, revealing metal shaped by human hands 4 centuries ago. That's what discovery actually feels like. Not a shout, not a trumpet, just the quiet moment when you realize that someone's work, someone's hope, is still resting here, waiting for you. The Atocha had begun to speak again. The language wasn't Spanish anymore, nor English, but something older. The universal vocabulary of salt, rust, and time. Each day the divers uncovered more. They found cannonballs, pewter cups, musket parts, even the delicate remnants of a comb carved from ivory. The sea had softened everything, rounding the sharpness of history. It was as if time itself had decided to tuck the ship in under a blanket of coral. On deck, the crew mapped every object's position. Dots turned into lines, lines turned into clusters, and the clusters began to tell a story. A slow, meandering trail across the seabed. The Atocha hadn't gone down in one piece. The hurricane had ripped her apart, scattering her cargo like breadcrumbs for future dreamers. Mel and his divers were tracing that trail backward, piece by piece, toward the motherlode. But even treasure hunts, when stretched across years, become a kind of meditation. Days blurred into each other. Salt on the skin, sun on the shoulders, the same gentle slap of water against the hull. They learned to read the ocean's moods. The way clouds stacked on the horizon meant a storm coming, or how a sudden school of fish might hint at disturbed sediment below. I like to think that by then, the Atocha had become part of their family, an invisible companion, stubborn and shy. Some nights, as the crew sat eating sandwiches wrapped in foil, they'd talk to her, half joking, half sincere, "Come on, old lady." They'd murmur into the waves, "Show us where you're hiding." One evening, after a long dive that yielded nothing but shards of pottery, Mel sat on deck watching the sunset melt into orange and rose. He held one of the fragments in his palm. Pale, curved, with a faint painted line still clinging to it. He turned it over slowly, smiling. "Even the broken bits are beautiful," he said. Deo leaned beside him. "That's how I feel about our kitchen plates," she joked softly, and they both laughed, the kind of laughter that comes easily after exhaustion. That's the thing about boring history. It's full of moments that seem small, but end up mattering most. Each chipped cup, each nail, was proof that the world's biggest treasures begin as someone's ordinary Tuesday cargo list. Weeks later, their patience shimmered into reward. A diver named Duncan brushed aside a patch of sand and found a cluster of coins fused together by centuries of salt. He signaled to the surface, bubbles spiraling upward like applause. When they cleaned them, the markings were unmistakable. The crossed pillars and waves of Spanish minting. Each coin had once passed through a dozen hands, miners, traders, officers, before finding its long rest on the ocean floor. Now it gleamed dully under Key West sunlight, edges softened by time. History reborn as pocket-sized moons. It's funny how even wealth looks sleepy after a few centuries underwater. No shine, no sparkle, just a grey calmness, as if the treasure itself had learned patience. But the calm didn't last on land. The state of Florida, upon hearing of Mel's finds, claimed ownership of the treasure under maritime law. Suddenly, the peaceful rhythm of dives and discoveries was replaced with court filings, hearings, and paperwork thick enough to build another ship. It seemed that history loved irony. A man following centuries-old documents to find a ship lost by bureaucracy was now being buried in bureaucracy himself. Mel didn't lose faith. Each morning he still began with the same words, "Today's the day." And each evening, even after legal setbacks, he'd stare at the horizon as though the sea itself might offer reassurance. He said once, "You can't rush the ocean. You can only learn her schedule." Meanwhile, his crew kept diving. The line of finds, coins, bars, weapons, stretched longer, curling east like a lazy river. Then, one grey dawn, they found something extraordinary. 9 bronze cannons, each one engraved with the insignia of the Atocha. They were beautiful in their decay, green with patina, coral clinging like lace. To divers who had spent years chasing rumors, those cannons felt like a heartbeat under the sand. The excitement was cut short the very next night. One of their boats capsized in rough water, taking with it 3 members of the team, including Mel's son, Dirk. It was a loss that could have ended everything. For weeks afterward, the boat sat anchored in silence. The sea, once full of promise, now felt too vast, too heavy. Mel didn't dive for a while. He spent long hours staring at the water, listening to its rhythm. It's hard to imagine that kind of quiet. Not peaceful, but hollow, like the silence after a song ends before the applause begins. In time, he returned. He said the best way to honor those who'd been lost was to finish the conversation the Atocha had started. So the search continued. Slower now, gentler, with a reverence that wasn't there before. By the end of the decade, the court case had also turned. Mel won. officially granted rights to everything he'd found and would yet find. He framed the ruling and hung it beside a photograph of his crew. In the photo, everyone is sunburned, smiling, squinting into the wind. They look ordinary, the way legends always do at the time. Still, the Atocha's true resting place, the central hold where her richest cargo lay, remained hidden. The line of artifacts had gone quiet again, like a radio fading to static. The crew shifted search grids, recalibrated instruments, and followed every hint of metal. Days passed into months, months into years. The treasure hunters aged under the same Florida sun that had watched the ship go down. And then, on a summer morning in 1985, 16 years after the first dive, the sea finally exhaled. A magnetometer reading spiked. The signal was strong, metallic, insistent. Divers dropped into the water, descending through schools of silver fish. They followed the line of the reading, heart steady, bubbles soft. And there, rising out of the sand like a dream returning, was an 80-foot stretch of hull, still holding stacks of silver bars, cannons, and chests of coins. For a moment, no one moved. Even the ocean seemed to pause. A turtle drifted by, unbothered, as though to say, "Well, you finally made it." When they surfaced, the boat erupted in quiet celebration. Laughter, tears, the clatter of tanks being dropped to the deck. Mel looked toward the sky, eyes damp, and whispered, "Today's the day." He had said it so many times that it had become a mantra. But this time, it was true. Among the treasure were emeralds. More than 2,000 of them, glowing green even through centuries of sleep. No bigger than a thumb, would later be valued at nearly $1 million. But the real worth, Mel said, wasn't in the gems or coins. It was in knowing that persistence could outlast storms, laws, and time itself. Sometimes I imagine him sitting there that evening, the wreck illuminated by dive lights far below, and above him the same stars that had watched the Atocha sink. The sea, I think, must have felt lighter that night, relieved to share her secret at last. If you listen closely, you might still hear a faint metallic song beneath the waves off the Florida Keys. Not the noise of greed, but of gratitude. A ship, once lost, whispering thank you to the patience that found her. And as we leave that silver-lit reef behind, let your thoughts drift too, through quiet water and warm air, toward the next part of our story. Because though the treasure was found, the mystery of the Atocha still glimmers. How something can vanish, rest, and return. And how even the ocean remembers. Some people build their lives out of stone, others out of stories. Mel Fisher built his out of salt water and patience. Even after the Atocha's treasure was found, the man could never quite stop searching. Not for gold this time, but for the feeling of discovery itself. Let me paint the morning after that great find. The sea was glassy, the air almost sweet. Crew members moved slowly around the deck, still dazed, their hands smelling faintly of diesel and salt. They talked in half sentences, the way people do after something too big to name has happened. Coffee steamed in chipped mugs. Gulls circled lazily overhead. It should have felt like an ending, but to Mel, it felt like dawn. He stood barefoot on the deck, a camera crew's lights glinting on his sunburned skin. When a reporter asked how it felt to discover the world's most valuable shipwreck, he grinned. "Great," he said. Then he squinted at the horizon and added, "But we're not done yet." That was Mel, the man who looked at completion and saw a comma instead of a period. He believed the ocean still had more stories folded inside her. The Atocha's stern castle, for instance, was still missing. Somewhere down there might lie the ship's bell, or the captain's cabin, or one last chest of emeralds pretending to be rock. And so the search went on, not as frantic as before, slower, steadier, a kind of gentle ritual. The divers who had once chased fortune now chased familiarity, the hiss of air tanks, the muffled hum of prop wash, the way light trembled through 15 meters of water like the pulse of a heartbeat. Mel called those dives visits. He said he liked to check in on the old lady, to make sure she was comfortable. Sometimes he'd descend just to sit on the seabed for a while, his gloved hand resting on a cannon, as if greeting an old friend. That, he'd later tell students, was the real treasure. Learning how to be still in a world that never stopped moving. Back on land, life changed in ways that felt both ordinary and surreal. The Fishers opened a small museum in Key West. White walls, soft lighting, and the faint smell of seawater that clung to every exhibit. Visitors wandered past glass cases filled with coins, emeralds, and gold chains that looked like frozen sunlight. Kids pressed their noses to the glass, whispering, "Wow." Parents read the captions aloud in quiet awe. At the back of the room, a short film looped endlessly. The story of the storm, the search, the discovery. Mel narrated it in his steady, slightly raspy voice. When the film reached the part where he said, "Today's the day," you could see people smile without meaning to. It's hard not to smile at optimism that pure he gave talks too. Not the loud, self-important kind. More like long conversations over coffee. He told audiences that treasure hunting was 10% luck and 90% paperwork. That line always drew a laugh, but he meant it. He'd spent more hours in archives and courtrooms than underwater. History, he'd say, is just archaeology done with pens. Outside the museum, life in the Keys moved at its own lazy rhythm. Palm fronds rattled, mopeds buzzed, and the air carried that faint mix of sunscreen and fried shrimp that belongs only to coastal towns. Every so often, Mel would wander down to the docks to watch divers preparing for a trip. He'd offer advice, sometimes stories, always encouragement. He had become, without realizing it, the patron saint of patient adventurers. Evenings found him on his porch, a glass of iced tea sweating beside him, the horizon blurring into violet. He liked to sit in silence, listening to crickets and the far-off roll of waves. Sometimes a storm brewed to the south, lightning flickering like a camera flash behind distant clouds. He never seemed afraid of storms anymore. He treated them like old acquaintances returning for small talk. Dea would join him, her knitting needles clicking softly. They'd talk about the grandchildren, about weather, about nothing at all. After all those years chasing the sea, quiet felt like luxury. But even in rest, Mel's mind wandered seaward. He funded other expeditions, lent equipment to young divers, taught them how to read the ocean's moods. He told them that every beep on a metal detector was a potential paragraph in the story of humanity. Don't rush to the end, he'd warn. Half the joy is in turning the pages slowly. One summer evening, he gave an interview from his porch. The camera caught him mid-sentence as a warm breeze lifted the edges of his notes. He chuckled, smoothed them down and said, "You know, people think treasure hunting is about finding gold. But really, it's about finding reasons to keep waking up." Then he looked straight at the lens, as though speaking to anyone who'd ever doubted their own persistence. "Keep searching," he said softly. "Whatever it is, it's out there." Those words became something of a motto for dreamers everywhere. You could find them printed on postcards in souvenir shops, etched on plaques in dive schools. Even now, long after he's gone, Some of his crew still repeat the phrase before a dive. A small ritual of courage in bubbles, Mel passed away in 1998, peacefully at home. The sea was calm that day. Friends said it felt as if the ocean itself had paused to take a breath. In Key West, flags on dive boats fluttered half-mast, and museum visitors stood a little longer by his portrait. Beneath his photograph, a brass plaque reads simply, "Today's the day I like to imagine that somewhere the Atocha heard the news." The old ship stirring gently in her sandy cradle, her timbers creaking in gratitude. After all, the two had been bound together for nearly half a century. One man on the surface, one ship below, both stubbornly alive in their own way. In the years that followed, divers continued to explore the wreck. Technology improved. Sonar images grew sharper, magnetometers more sensitive. They found new fragments, a ring here, a silver spoon there, each one a soft echo of the original discovery. But none of them ever chased the dream quite like Mel had. Maybe because they understood that the real treasure was the patience he taught them. If you visit the site today, you can drift above the wreck in perfect silence. The water is warm, the visibility endless. Fish shimmer around the coral-encrusted cannons. A few coins still glint faintly among the rocks, but most have been lifted, catalogued, preserved. What remains is atmosphere, the slow breathing of history beneath you. Sometimes divers say they feel watched there, not in a spooky way, but kindly, as though the sea itself is keeping an eye on those who come to listen. They describe a sense of calm, of completion, like visiting an elderly relative who finally got to finish her story. Maybe that's what all searching is about, giving unfinished stories their endings. For Mel, it wasn't enough to find treasure. He wanted to restore a conversation between the living and the lost. He once said, "The ocean forgets nothing. She just waits for someone polite enough to ask." I think that's what makes this tale so strangely restful. It reminds us that persistence doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just hums, a low, steady note beneath the noise of waves and wind. If you listen for it tonight, you might hear it too. The sound of people, centuries apart, connected by curiosity and the will to keep going. Outside your window, maybe the world is quiet now. A streetlight hums, a breeze moves the curtains. Let that sound blend with the rhythm of waves you've been imagining. Picture the Florida Keys bathed in moonlight, the water clear and shallow, the outline of the Atocha resting peacefully below. Somewhere nearby, a small boat drifts, its anchor line gently taut, its crew asleep under a sky crowded with stars. That's where we'll leave Mel Fisher for now. The man who refused to stop searching, finally at rest beside the sea that once kept him awake. And as we drift onward, breathe in slowly. The story isn't over yet. The sea still has one last lullaby to sing, about treasure, memory, and the soft shimmer of dreams that refuse to sink. There is a kind of hush that belongs only to endings. It isn't silence exactly, more a soft exhale like the sea smoothing itself after a storm. That is how the story of the Atocha settles now, after 400 years of waiting, searching, and remembering. If you could sink down to her resting place tonight, you would find a world made entirely of calm. The light there is always blue, the temperature steady as a heartbeat. Coral has claimed the edges of the timbers. Sponges bloom in pastel folds. Fish drift through windows that once framed the horizon. Everything moves slowly, as if time itself has learned to float. A diver's torch sweeps across the sand and catches a faint gleam. A silver coin, half buried. He reaches for it, and a puff of silt rises, then drifts away like smoke. The coin lies in his palm, cool and heavy, a perfect circle of history. He turns it over, sees the worn stamp of a Spanish cross, and wonders whose fingers last touched it before his. Was it a sailor, a merchant, a king's accountant? The sea doesn't say, she never does. That small piece of silver, worth only a few dollars in today's currency, has traveled farther than most people ever will. Mined in the mountains of Bolivia, hammered into shape in Lima, loaded onto a mule, carried to Panama, shipped across the Caribbean, and finally laid to rest beneath 50 feet of water. 3 centuries later, it surfaces briefly, just long enough to prove that nothing truly disappears. When I think of the Atocha now, I don't picture treasure chests overflowing with gold. I picture stories, thousands of them, stacked like the silver bars in her hold. Stories of sailors who sang while coiling rope, of women waiting on balconies in Seville, of historians bent over desks, squinting at faded ink, of divers breathing in rhythm with the sea, all of them connected by one thread, the quiet persistence of curiosity. The wreck has become an underwater garden. Schools of yellowtail flash between the ribs of the hull. Soft coral fans out like lace curtains. Sometimes a nurse shark drifts through, unhurried, the custodian of a forgotten cathedral. The sound there isn't frightening, just the low crackle of shrimp, the occasional creak of metal, the whisper of bubbles. If peace had a voice, it might sound like that. Every year, new divers visit the site. Some are scientists measuring corrosion. Others are tourists chasing wonder. They descend in pairs, lights glowing like tiny suns, and the water folds around them in velvet darkness. For a few minutes, they hover among the artifacts, careful not to stir the sand, aware they are guests in a museum curated by nature. When they return to the surface, their voices are hushed, as if they've left a library. In the museum in Key West, children still press their faces to the glass. They trace the outlines of coins with their fingers, imagining what it would feel like to find one under the sea. A guide tells them the story of Mel Fisher, of his family, of the 16 years it took to prove that hope can be heavier than gold. Parents listen too, nodding slowly. The air smells faintly of salt even here, as though the sea insists on keeping a presence. There's a case near the entrance that holds a single emerald, no bigger than a grape, green as bottled light. Beside it, a small card reads, "Recovered 1985, Atocha Emerald." Visitors lean closer. Some whisper, "Wow," under their breath. The gem itself says nothing. It simply glows, patient and self-contained, like the memory of a promise kept. Outside, the sun beats down on the docks, and the water beyond the harbour sparkles. Pelicans dive, boat engines sputter, and the everyday world hums along. Most of the people who visit the museum will never see the wreck itself, but that hardly matters. The story has already done its work. It has turned history into comfort, tragedy into rhythm, and a storm into a lullaby. There is an old saying among divers: we go down not to escape life but to find it. The Atocha, in her long sleep, has given life to countless others, historians, explorers, dreamers, even insomniacs listening to her story tonight. She reminds us that patience is a form of faith, and that even in darkness, beauty waits quietly for the right moment to surface. If you close your eyes now, you might picture yourself floating above that quiet reef. The water presses gently against your ears. The light dances in slow ribbons. Somewhere below, silver rests beside coral, history breathing in small bubbles. You exhale, and the sound blends perfectly with the ocean's own sigh. Let your thoughts drift farther back to the sailors of 1622. Imagine them on the deck, laughing, unaware that their journey would outlast them by centuries. They spoke of home, of families, of wine, of weather. Their words have dissolved, but their laughter lingers, trapped in salt crystals, sparkling whenever sunlight hits the waves just right. Perhaps that's what the ocean keeps for us. Not the things, but the sounds, the hum of hope, the murmur of ordinary joy. It's comforting to think that nothing is truly lost, only translated into another language of motion and light. And so the Atocha remains there still, half asleep, half awake. She is less a ship now than a memory of wood and metal, a shape carved by patience. Crabs walk her decks, coral crowns her bow. Every so often a storm passes overhead, stirring the sand like turning a page, and she shifts slightly, as if rolling over in her dreams. When the hurricane season ends, the sea grows glassy again, and the wreck settles back into her slumber. The sunlight filters down, and the treasure sleeps on, untouched, unhurried, perfectly at peace. It's strange, isn't it? A story that began with chaos and greed ends with quiet and generosity. The ocean, after all, returned most of what it took: silver, emeralds, and the reminder that even in destruction, something gentle can endure. If you ever find yourself walking along a beach near Key West at dusk, pause for a moment. The air will taste faintly of salt and old stories. Look out at the horizon. Somewhere beneath that water lies the Atocha, glowing softly in the twilight of the deep. You might even hear a faint echo of a voice saying, "Today's the day." Or perhaps that's just the tide brushing against the shore, repeating the words that once carried a man through 16 years of waiting. Either way, it means the same thing. There is always something worth finding, even if what you find is peace. So now, as you lie back, let the story fade like the last light on calm water. Feel the weight of your blanket, the softness of your pillow. Listen to your own breath, steady as the tide. The Atocha rests. Mel Fisher rests. And you can rest too. May these memories guide you into peaceful dreams. If you drifted off somewhere along the way, that's all right. The sea will finish the story for you. But if you're still awake, and this calm journey helped you unwind, you can tap like or subscribe. Only if it feels right. For now, close your eyes. The waves are slow. The stars are patient. The treasure sleeps, and so should you. Good night, friends. Sweet dreams.